The Misfits.
So I grew up going to church every Sunday and enjoyed it for what it was. But to me, it felt, my experience of it was kind of another school subject. Something that I learned the creeds, I learned the things I needed to go through my confirmation process and become a member of the church I grew up in, which was a Presbyterian church in South Minneapolis. And it wasn't until my 18th birthday, in the midst of attempting suicide for the second time, that I ended up again at a church, having been invited by a friend. And as I walked through the doors of the church, the weight, that heaviness that people sometimes describe when they talk about clinical depression, lifted off of me, and I experienced for a moment life without that. And instinctually, I understood in that moment that I was wrong about Jesus and I was wrong about God and the cross. I had an understanding of those things that you lived your life, and depending on what you believed and what you did after your death, you would find out, did you believe the right things and do the right things? And if you did, you'd go to heaven. And in that moment, I understood that the cross was actually for now, and that the freedom of the cross was for us to experience today so that we could be and enjoy God's presence. And as I spent an hour in the church, I was in a really weird state of mind. Left, the weight came back, but it completely reoriented the direction of my life going forward. And here I am 22 years later, living in France, doing ministry, and doing my best to help people experience presence with God.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are in the middle of our series on monasticism and mysticism and misfits. And so we are today continuing on. We have a special guest coming here, and we are going to be talking today. Last week we talked with Stefan about new monasticism, and he helped clarify some things that he left us short of the last time he had been on. And now today we're going another direction, but the same direction at the same time, because why would we do things simply when we introduce people? And Paul Prins is here from France to talk with us about a different layer of new monasticism, and this is what he's calling urban monasticism. And so, Paul, welcome to Misfits. We are going to hopefully get through a couple of different things. We're going to talk about his book, we're going to talk about his ministry, and we're going to talk about how even in reality, those that are like, yeah, monasticism is not for me, how some of the things that he is working on and teaching on and writing on is something that we definitely should be applying regardless of if you're wanting to go full on monastic or not. So, yeah. Paul, let's start off by talking about just you in general. So we heard a little bit about your story already.
Yep.
But the one thing I'm sure that everybody is trying to really figure out is, how did you end up in Paris? Because Paul Prins does not sound French. You definitely sound Midwestern. So
yeah,
how did you end up in France?
Et en fait, je parle français très bien. The France question is a good one. So when I was in university, kind of playing off a little bit of my introduction there, that story happened on my 18th birthday. So it was high school. It was actually the end of my junior year of high school. And so when I got to university, I'm at this point where I'm like a year and a half to really taking my faith in Christianity seriously. I'd gotten involved in the largest student ministry on campus in Wisconsin, where I was going to school, which was Campus Crusade. They happened to have a partnership with a couple places internationally, one being Toulouse, France. And so that summer after my freshman year, I went and spent 6 weeks in Toulouse, France. And it was actually in France where I felt and heard the calling to vocational ministry. It was actually inside of an old convent, Convent des Jacobins in Toulouse. And in the old days, now when you hear convent, you think, oh, it's a community of sisters, religious community of sisters. Historically, the word convent actually just meant basically a monastery that wasn't monastic. So it could be mendicant or it could be another religious order. And so in the 30 feet from the body of St. Thomas Aquinas, in this cloister is kind of where I felt and accepted a call to vocational ministry, not knowing exactly what that would be. I came back to France for a year. It was okay. It was very affirming about being in France, and also very affirming that I can't do initiative-based evangelism for a whole number of reasons. And my wife and I were dating at the time I went for the year. We got engaged while I was over here with kind of the understanding that I would be in France. I had actually, I believe, I've audibly heard the voice of God tell me to go to France for that year. I was in a room of other people. I heard this voice say, go to France. I respond, as one does, with no. As I'm looking around, thinking like maybe it was just something over the PA that they're like doing, and nobody else was responding. And then the voice said, yes, you're going to France. And so the question then became like, well, what do we do? The call had a location, but it wasn't even that specific, around like Paris or whatever part of the country. And also we didn't know what we'd be doing. I grew up in a Presbyterian church in South Minneapolis that had been there for like 100 years. And when I was in university, it was the first time I got exposed to the idea of church planting, which was very interesting. Again, my church was 100 years old. The idea of like PCUSA is not planting churches regularly. And so got to be a part of one in Minneapolis. My wife and I were like, we're different than the pastor and the pastors, but like, we're not that dissimilar. Maybe we can do this. So I got my divinity degree at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, graduated in 2012. And then we had been running a tech company to try and tent make bootstrap ministry. And that went okay, middling success. But it got us to France. We're both big city people. Paris is the big city in France. And yeah, we moved in January, actually, 2016, with the intentions of starting a French-speaking church, giving ourselves time just to figure out, what is God actually inviting us to do here? And in that process, over those first couple of years, it was a difficult transition. Immigrating to another country is a difficult process. I found myself falling back into more contemplative, meditative rhythms. I was I think many Protestants and even Catholics might relate to this. Like, I didn't know much of anything about monasticism growing up. It wasn't a thing we talked about. At my church growing up, it wasn't a thing that came up in school. I went to public school. And it wasn't until actually a church history course in seminary where we talked about the Benedictines and the rule of Saint Benedict, and kind of the role, specifically the role that monasticism played in the medieval period in Europe in sustaining the church and sustaining society after the fall of Rome. And that, I felt a kinship kind of with that introduction, and went and read the rule of Saint Benedict and felt like, oh my gosh, in a different life, like this could be me. And so as we were in France, and I found myself falling back into and needing to fall back into kind of meditative and contemplative practices to sustain myself. I found myself pulled more and more in that, like, kind of this very intentional living by a way of life. And then you're like, well, I wonder if other people would do this with us, and what would it look like to do this in our urban context. And so that's kind of like the genesis of how we got to France, and kind of the ebbs and flows through that process to starting urban monasticism over 5 years ago now. So,
and what's interesting is that when you're talking about all of this, and then the stuff that I can remember actually hearing about from like history classes dealing with the monks or the sisters, either one.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those that we heard about, or the work that we heard about, was done in, at the time, what we would classify as an urban setting. But yet now, when we're talking about the idea of doing what when we think about what monastics would do, we immediately start picturing rural settings up in the mountains away from everybody else.
Yeah.
What do you think actually caused us to have this shift sort of thing in our thinking? Is it due to the fact that we now associate more monasteries with like Tibetan monks, or is it to do with just this sort of, because I know within the ministry work that I've done, which has always been more inner city focused, that
Mm-hmm.
there's been a sort of anti-city sort of spirit and heart within, especially within American Christianity.
No, for sure.
You don't go to the city, that's where all the evil stuff happens.
Sin's in the city, holiness is in the fields.
What do you think caused us to have this shift?
Yeah, I do think historically there has not been a lot of monasticism within cities. There's a number of religious orders, and some of those are very urban centric. A lot of the mendicant groups, so like the Jesuits and the Dominicans and whatnot, are, maybe the city you live in has a Loyola University or a Jesuit university in it. They're mendicant. It's similar but different. Most monasteries have kind of traditionally always been outside of the city context, and yet most monasteries are also basically little cities or villages in themselves. And so if you roll back a few centuries, before modern urbanization, before colonialism empowered the urbanization of Europe and the Americas, you had, most cities were a couple thousand people. You had monasteries that were that size. The structure of those architecturally were very different. The way they were governed was very different, but you had a lot of the same functions going on. You had people making bread, working fields, like doing all of the animal husbandry and the work to sustain life there. Monasteries also had the academics, so they had the libraries, the scribes, and that kind of stuff, that they did that work for money as well as to assist ministry. So they, hand copy books onto vellum or paper to either like maintain old aging manuscripts or to make copies of books for people with financial means for that kind of a thing. But like even here in Paris, there was a ministry school back when the city was much smaller. I'm on the right bank. It was on the left bank. Conventes Bernardines, I think it was Cistercian. And they taught a large portion of the clergy in France how to be clergy. And it was outside the city. You had to walk outside the city gate, across a field, and you got to the monastery. Well, now if you look at a map of Paris, there's one part of the building that remains, Collège des Bernardines, if you want to look it up. It is in the middle of the Latin Quarter. like the city spans so far beyond it. And it wasn't until about the late 1700s, early 1800s that they sold that land and built a new monastery further out. And so there's always been a bit of like we're trying to create a space that is kind of the reign of heaven on earth. We structure our time and our days in ways that emphasize prayerfulness and allow us to commune with God. There's this kind of cliche phrase, but it's, we're alone together. That is very much monasticism. The idea of community within a monastic cloister is much different than the community that you'd have at your church or a small group. But it's incredibly meaningful. But I think within that model, you can see that they're kind of emulating, hey, here's what a city looks like, and here's what a monastery looks like. You can see all the things that are similar, but you can also see that something different and special and unique is happening here. And everybody's welcome to come in and join us for prayers, for markets, for hospitality, for medical treatment, for all of these things that have been historic markers of monasticism. But it is like similar but different. And so that kind of leads to today where it's like, well, for the first time in human history, more than half of humanity lives in urban areas, in urban contexts. So if we were to establish monasticism today, we would more than likely do it within an urban context. And so then that raises a lot of questions, though. Like, what does that look like? How do you do that?
And somebody should write a book on it, right?
Yeah, almost like somebody did write a book on it.
So I want to real quick before we even jump into that, because one of the things you said there towards the end is something that we've been trying to find better ways to define.
Okay.
And it's interesting, the different levels of doing is when you talk about the fact that there's the community aspect is a massive piece of all of this, but it looks very different than what you normally think of when you think of community.
Mm-hmm.
Walk us through a little bit. What does community actually look like and mean to you specifically, but especially within this monastic history and idea and movement and everything else?
Yeah, I mean, I will start by saying that monasticism is old. It goes all the way back to the Desert Fathers and Antony in Egypt. There is no one expression of it. We are within the cenobinic or the communal stream of monasticism, but there also are individuals that do monasticism without community. A lot of the early folks, including Anthony, he went off and hid and spent his time in old military forts that were, long abandoned, alone, and he was monastic. And then you have, the Benedictines, who some of those communities numbered in the thousands, and so obviously those look different. I think one of the main ways that community looks different, and again, different groups have different rules and they apply those rules maybe in different ways, but a lot of communities even have vows of silence.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we think about meeting up with friends and having community, a major component of that is just talking about life, sharing ideas, all of that kind of stuff. And in a lot of traditional monastic communities, like that wouldn't be as much a part of it. There are some really wonderful traditions where, during meal times and during different times, you would have somebody who would go up oftentimes to an elevated position, and they would read the Bible, they'd read theology texts, they'd read history texts, and you'd sit there and eat and listen and think about and meditate on what's being read, and then you'd go back to your work. And if your work wasn't, the transcribing what someone's telling you, and reading to you, you'd have time to prayerfully kind of dig through and think about what was shared over lunch, or maybe something from the divine office that you prayed before earlier in the day, or from the Psalms and the scripture you've memorized. And so community then looks different in a bunch of different contexts. And it is one of the part of the community that I find really beautiful, and that I think helps us in kind of our disconnected urban context, is that even in the midst of all of that, you have these touch points. If it's praying the divine office, celebrating the Eucharist, where you come together, and in the middle of that moment, your voice and your presence and your prayers mingle with the presence and prayers of everybody else around the world who is joining in those prayers, the people who have come before you, the people who will come after you. And so there is this kind of eternalness to some of the fundamental prayer practices and practices of being a monastic. That there's a reason why the divine office or the liturgy of the hours is called the prayer of the church, because it is the prayer that is prayed every day all around the world without ceasing. And we get to participate in that. And there's a communal aspect to that I find really beautiful. And so it is a bit of a challenge, because people come in with this assumption of like, oh, this is what community means. We have to be chatting every day and like invested in one another's lives. And yes, like I enjoy that deeply. I have that with many people. But there has to be, how do we connect the traditional monastic experience with what we're trying to do in our life today? It's not just simply it has to be more than simply like, well, we live together, or we see each other once a week and we know what's going on in each other's lives. That's beautiful and wonderful. But I think the monastic tradition calls us to more than that. And to understand that the ways we relate to one another are fundamentally spiritual and transcend this specific moment in history. And so how do we connect and relate to one another and learn how to do that well? That's difficult.
And, part of the reason why we wanted to talk through that part of it was because, a couple weeks ago, remember when Bluebeard was on, talking about the metaphysics of the Holy Spirit. This is part of what he was talking about. And again, it's because it comes out of the Desert Fathers and everything like that with the mysticism stuff, is that the way that the Spirit connects us goes beyond anything that we can do in any kind of earthly setting. Yeah. Even though we feel the earthly results,
sometimes
the connection goes beyond an earthly setting to where, and that's you worded it much more poetically than he did, of this idea of, it connects us to, it's a prayer from eternity, of where it's just, it's ongoing and everything like that. So with that in mind, when we start to talk about what this looks like, you kind of already have started us down the path a little bit, because one of the things that is very evident if you just even flip through your book is that prayer is at the forefront of a lot of what it means to actually start down this kind of path and what you're looking to do. So we can start with prayer and then move forward a little bit, but what does urban monasticism actually look like in terms of, not just the community aspect, but the personal, the discipleship aspect, and what this looks like in the world?
Yeah, just that little question. No, it's great. I think for me on this journey, there's been this process of understanding, and that post-Enlightenment, we have created categories that we've kind of allowed to run rampant a little bit. And so, the first chapter of our book, The Urban Monastic Way of Life, chapter 1, is to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And I don't actually know that those 4 things are different. I think they're describing different parts of the same thing. And so when we talk about how we exist in the world and we talk about prayer, a lot of us have categories of, well, spirituality is over here, physicality is over here, my mental self is here, my mind and body maybe. Soul is kind of a weird, ambiguous thing that maybe ties them together, but we don't really know. But historically, these things haven't actually been as pulled apart and segregated as that. Yeah. And so when we talk about prayer in a monastic context, it's in some ways it's really mundane. Like, yeah, we pray the divine office, which is this wonderful set of liturgical prayers that are almost exclusively scripture. You're praying psalms and canticles, which are different passages from the Old and New Testament, kind of structured to be more poetic. You're praying antiphons, which the vast majority come from scripture. And you're basically offering scripture back up to God as you allow it to kind of wash over yourself in the process. And through those prayers, there's the kind of, historically they're every 3 hours, because this was a process, a kind of prayer that was developed in the intertestamental period, where they used the Roman market bells that started at 6 a.m. and rang once every 3 hours. And so 6, 9, 12, 3, 6, 9. And so they just put prayers at those, because there's a passage in the Psalms that says 7 times a day, Lord, I praise you. And so that's kind of the genesis of that style of prayer. Obviously, ours is adapted a bit because we have New Testament scripture in there, which, Jesus couldn't have prayed. But there's many points in the New Testament where these prayers come up. And so what you see is that by having kind of these anchors, at least at the beginning and end of your day, it creates a prayerful posture. And it also helps kind of embed scripture kind of in your heart and your soul, within yourself, so that as you're moving throughout the day, it's easier to see all the things you're doing as prayerful. Mm-hmm. It's easier to see that when I'm gracious and kind to a stranger on the street, that that's actually an expression of love and prayer that I'm doing together with God, and an expression of mercy or grace. And so you have kind of these more structured prayers that, for me anyway, it gives me this experience of, it kind of overflows into the ways I am throughout the rest of the day. And it allows those moments to be prayerful. And for me, I think of prayer more in the sense of this posture that allows words, thoughts, and emotions to move between God and ourselves. And so when I'm kind and generous and embody the fruit of the Spirit, and I act like Jesus in my neighborhood, that is a moment where I'm experiencing God maybe moving and working through me, or being pleased by the fact that I'm acting as Christ would, or I'm embodying the fruit of the Spirit in creation with the Holy Spirit. Like that, how is that? That has to be prayer. Like I don't know how else to talk about it if we don't get to use that prayer language, because the second we remove the prayer language, it becomes something that I'm responsible for. And that terrifies me, because I know enough of myself to know that I would rather just hide from the world and then engage and be present, let alone engage and be kind and gentle and patient and loving. So
yeah, I think the way you word it there, I think, is the perfect way to actually talk about this, as far as, we're almost told that prayer is eyes closed, bowed heads.
Asking for stuff. Or saying things that you got stuff.
But the idea of it being the moment that I say it's not a prayer, the moment it's now me taking responsibility, or not necessarily taking responsibility, but making me the priority, I guess is a better way of saying it, I think is a much better image of what it actually means to pray without ceasing. Is this idea of if we are always in that kind of mindset of God can do it, I just have to ask.
Yeah.
It changes everything in terms of the mindset, to where it is now something that's going to help us with anxiety. It is now something that's going to help us with loving our neighbor better. It is something that's going to help us love our city better. Rather than just these, and I think the irony of it is that you started out talking about the fact that it's not necessarily timed out, but it's rhythmic, and it's something where it's like you're praying these set things, and it's what we typically hear people that have never looked into this stuff before start to call just traditionalism and everything else, and that's not really Christianity and all this other kind of stuff. But the reality is, it's much less traditional and much more lifestyle than what we traditionally would normally talk about prayer within, especially a Protestant setting.
Yeah. And I mean, it is a very traditional prayer. Like, the structure of it goes back over 1,000 years.
Right.
Obviously, like, I'm in the process of translating the Urban Monastic Breviary into English and French. So, like, we have contemporary language. We aren't praying in Latin. And even the Latin books for the Liturgy of the Hours are using new Latin translations based on modern just textual information that we have. We have better manuscripts and source text criticism than they did, than Jerome did all those years ago. And so the Nova Vulgate actually is a retranslation into Latin that is the current Latin text for that, for folks that care to pray the more traditional version. Like, even that is not more traditional. And so, yeah, when it comes to these prayers, it's if prayer can only be us asking things and giving thanks for things, then I don't know how we're present with God. Like, I don't know how to do that in that context. I can come up with philosophy that says, well, like, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, so therefore, like, wherever I am, like, the fullness of God dwells within me, and that's wonderful as an idea. But monasticism, and I believe Christianity as a whole, is not about ideas. It's about the embodiment. I mean, the crux of Christianity is incarnation.
Yeah.
And if the incarnation is only relegated to that one moment in history, and none of us are called to be incarnate in our world with God, like, then I don't understand what the point is.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked multiple times, and unfortunately, with the political climate here, I've had this discussion multiple times just in the past 48 hours.
Yeah.
Of the fact that the gospel itself is incarnation.
Yeah, it's God with us.
We can't avoid it, because when we make everything the gospel talks about just spiritual, we lose sight of who Jesus was. If we make everything about it all physical, then we lose sight of who Jesus was.
Yeah.
And if we don't have both, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And within urban monasticism, the tagline that we use for it is, present with God, present with others. And that we rephrase it sometimes in different ways. I think on the book it says, become more present with God and others. But that idea that those two are actually interwoven. as I become present with God, that only happens if I'm developing and cultivating a greater presence with myself. And then in and through that, I'm able to be present with other people in deeper and more meaningful ways. But that's a lot of work. It's a lot of prayerful work. When we talk about things like meditation and contemplation, man, the number one thing you encounter in meditation and contemplation is yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are not doing that with God and God's grace and kindness and gentleness, oh my gosh, that seems terrifying to me. And then doing it together with God allows us to see who we are and who we can be. It allows us to be gentle with ourselves. It allows the slow, transformational, sanctifying work of God to happen in our lives. And that allows us to see things in other people and to extend kindness and grace and love to other people, because, you know, like every day I wake up, there's more grace than I'll need that day. And it's been refreshed and it's in abundance. And it's my time of meditative and contemplative prayer that has shown me the depths to which I need that.
So,
and the more you do that, the easier it becomes to be gracious with others, because you know how much grace you've received.
And that really is the direction we're going to kind of go to finish this part of the discussion off. So a couple of things real quick, because unfortunately it's the worst possible time for this out. I don't know if anybody else can hear it or not. If you start to hear chainsaws, whereas we're talking about meditation and quietness and contemplation, there are people cutting down trees in front of the studio at the moment. So sorry about that. But this isn't the only discussion Paul is going to be a part of throughout this series. So in next week, he and Nathan Daniel Blake are going to be coming back, and we're going to be talking about why these ideas and these lifestyles keep cycling throughout history and why they keep coming back. And then I haven't actually told him this yet, but I am now. He's also going to be coming back eventually, probably this summer, and we're going to actually walk through more of what spiritual disciplines actually look like and things like that. Yeah, surprise. I just booked you again. Because and the reason I'm saying that now is because of the fact that, so my audience knows, anybody that's been with us since season 1 knows that my ministry training was not good.
Okay.
It was dark, it was depressing, it was outside of Dr. Linville and Dr. Quigley, not really biblical, I guess you would say, as far as the foundation. And so, because of that, there's a lot of things that everything was off. But one thing that was very helpful that we had within the ministry department there at the school was that the first class that anybody within the theology department, well, no, maybe it was just the ministry department, took was walking through Richard Foster's book, the Celebration of Discipline.
Okay, nice.
And figuring out what the disciplines were and what ones that we actually enjoyed doing, what ones we had to work harder at, all these sort of things, and what they were and what they looked like. And, it was very helpful for me to have already had that as I started walking into a time that was extremely depressing and dark. And in some ways, a forced version of what you were just talking about what monasticism really is this idea of having to be alone with God. Being forced to that position, having that background already was very helpful. And so I think, especially with the climate of the world we're in now, somebody like you who's able to teach this stuff in a way that is accessible, I think is going to be very helpful. So that's just a spoiler for the summer. But beyond that, there's a couple of things that you talked about there when we were going through that we want to spend some time on specifically. So one of them that, even though I think you were talking about in a different light, it's going to help us get into the next step, is you were talking about the idea of the fact that in this post-enlightenment world, we just almost by default deal in categories.
Yep.
And the categories you were more talking about were the, mind, body, spirit, all that kind of stuff that we were going out of love the Lord your God. But I think there's another level of this. I don't know if it's something you're seeing or not there in France, but that we're seeing all the time here, of beyond just the mind, body, spirit type categories, that the default into categories is affecting the way that we are approaching this idea of how to love our neighbor and how to love our city.
Yeah.
And, you walk through, like we said, you walk through a couple other spiritual disciplines and things in your book. And you also talk about the monastic rhythms in your book, which is more of what we're going to talk about next week with Nate. But then you spend a good amount of time talking about this idea of loving your city and loving your neighbor. And both of those are ones that, unfortunately now, because of the climate we are living in, that both of those are being skewed into something beyond what you talk about here.
Yeah.
And what historically Christians have talked about in general. So, I want us just to kind of walk through. So I think actually the first place to do this is, let's start with what's the deal with the love your neighbors? Give us a brief overview on that part of it before we get into the city and the neighbors in our city and everything else.
Yeah. I will say I'll do a quick plug for the book just because I think it's pretty good. Chapter 12.
Yeah. I think, yeah.
Yeah.
Where I saw, 12 is the first place that I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. So love your neighbors as yourself. So this book is monastic communities. Real quick, I just kind of explain what a way of life is, and then I'll get into the neighbor piece. Monasticism, as it exists today, people commit to live an external way of life or a rule. And so before we began in 2019, I sat down and adapted the rule of St. Benedict for an urban context for people who weren't cloistered, had to work. We don't have the Catholic Church, funding this. And so how do you deal with things where you don't have the vows of poverty and chastity and obedience? So how do you contextualize the monastic life for people in a way that's accessible, that they can return to again and again? And so then this last year, I kind of revised it into the form that it's available in today on our website, as well as in print and ebook form, just to help people in a way as they're reading it, hopefully experience a bit of what we're talking about. And then at the end of each chapter, there's a long list of different prayerful ways to engage with the content. So little plug there, explaining a bit of what a way of life is, or a rule is, monastic rule. Ours has 28 chapters. If you want to be a monastic, you commit to embodying all of them. If you want to sojourn with us, you can kind of choose your own adventure, which ones you want to go along with. And you're absolutely right.
I'm picturing now that it's one of those. Do you save the poor kitty on the street? Turn to this page, and that's the image you just gave me. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's fasting is one of them. Like it's called love fasting. I love fasting. I know that there's people who don't, and they're not going to commit to cultivating a love for fasting. That's fine. Like, you can still sojourn with us. You can still enjoy and benefit from the fruitfulness of this life. But it is that acknowledgement that how we live our lives actually is an expression of prayerfulness, and the more we live intentionally with God, the easier it is for us to experience the presence of God and to be present with our neighbors. God is still the same. It's more about how we are able to experience being with God and with others. And so when we talk about loving our neighbor, the biggest struggle in loving our neighbor is ourselves. It has to do with, in the intro, I have depression. I've had it for a long time. I'm clinically depressed. I will never go away. I have had to do a lot of work to learn how to be present with myself, to be kind to myself, to be gentle with myself, to love myself. And that work spills over into the ways I'm able to be present with others. And it helps me realize even the fact that some important people in my life aren't able to be kind and gentle and loving to me in ways that I need. And so that means that, wow, maybe the ways that I naturally would default to do these things aren't the ways, the expressions that my neighbors would experience as loving. And so there's all these layers that come into this idea of loving your neighbor as yourself, that make it a wonderful invitation and command from Jesus. But also it's one of those things that it's only possible with grace and mercy, because we're going to make mistakes. But love is a commitment. It's a dedication to the other. If you read the description of love in 1 Corinthians 13, classic wedding passage, all of those things are things that you have to choose to do. And so we have to choose to love ourselves. We have to choose to love our neighbors today, tomorrow, and continue to choose love. In the same way that I woke up today and I chose to love my wife, my spouse. And I've done that every day for the last 18 years that we've been married. And so it's this idea that it's a conscious choice that we make, and that choice has ways it's expressed. The challenge comes when we ask the question that Jesus was asked many times, who is my neighbor? Clearly, it's the people in this building with me. I live in Center Paris. My neighborhood has a population density. I think it's close to 60,000 people per square mile. There's a lot of people here. There's also a lot of people 10 miles away, 100 miles away, 1,000 miles away, and those are also my neighbors. What about the people who came before me? They're my neighbors. Am I kind and loving to them? And the ways that we do that is, do we have histories? Are the stories we tell about what's happened before, are they accurate? They don't have to be glowing reviews. Humanity's done some not good things. But to be a good, loving neighbor is to be able to see things as they are. If I don't see you, Andrew, as you are, and I try to be kind and generous and loving towards you, but it's a caricature of you, that's actually not going to be helpful for you. You're not going to experience that as loving. And so it requires an attentiveness, a listening, ongoing education and understanding and learning about the world, about one another, about ourselves. I think most adults can look back and think of things they maybe did 10 years ago, maybe when they were children, that they thought were gestures of love or were really kind things. And then you realize now, like, oh, all I did was make a lot of more work for somebody else, or like that I did that for them because it was something I liked. But now I know that, like, maybe you made a meal for somebody that they couldn't even eat because they have like a dietary thing, and it's just like, great, like I'm sure you felt good about that, but like they didn't experience that they didn't get to experience the love of it. And if we approach loving our neighbors from a Christ-like posture, then the intention has to be like, what is good for you?
Yeah.
Because that is what Christ models again and again for us in the Gospels.
Yeah, I have never heard anybody actually talk about how to love our previous neighbors well.
Mm-hmm. And the neighbors to come. So
and the neighbor, well, and yeah, and it goes with the neighbors to come as well, but especially with what we're seeing and what we have seen throughout, the majority of, the majority of history in general, but especially in our context here, of, are we actually loving our neighbor if we are spreading misinformation?
Yep.
If we are not talking about history correctly.
Mm-hmm.
If we're not, and honestly, I think it goes into a little bit of what you were talking about with the prayer side of it more as well, of this idea. Are we just looking at history as, people or, things on a page, or are we talking about them as image bearers that came before us? Where and same thing exactly. You talk about the prayer of when we're talking about this prayer of eternity, we're praying with other believers that have come before. And it's a completely different shift in how we approach everything once we start looking at things from that lens.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So keep going. Keep walking us through, because we've gone through the first step of what does this actually mean? What does this look like? Which, part of the reason why, you and I were talking about this off camera also is this idea of the fact, we unfortunately, there's no one right now that has paid any attention to the media that doesn't understand that this is a little bit of a contentious topic, both in Christianity and outside at the moment, as far as what does it actually mean to love our neighbor. But even beyond that, the picture of what it means to love our neighbor, you just made it 1,000 times more complicated, unfortunately, for a lot of us, because now we have to go beyond just thinking, okay, am I treating the person I'm coming across right, to am I even thinking about the people that came before me right?
Mm-hmm.
So now we've added a whole nother layer. Let's now move it into more of a context here.
Yeah.
What does this look like in an urban setting? Because again, this is something where we talked about from the beginning. Unfortunately, there is this anti-urbanization bias within a lot of Christianity. And this doesn't just extend to just Protestantism or evangelicalism or anything. This is something that we see throughout the history of Christianity in a lot of ways.
Yep.
How do we actually do this thing about loving our neighbors well in these urban contexts?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's helpful to explain what I mean by urban. For me, in its most simplest form, urban is just about density. I do not expect that where you live has the population density that my neighborhood in Paris does. Yeah. I am in one of the densest cities in the Western world. But all of the things that we might associate with urban living are really, they flow from the fact that people are living very close together. And so that creates different ways of living just by default. I don't have a car. I walk to the grocery store. I walk to the bakery. I actually rarely use transit because I just like walking. But when I do need to get around, it's by public transit, it's by train, a little bit by plane. But I can get most places I need to without leaving the ground. And so that creates very different ways of existing in the world. Where I'm sitting, looking at my camera. Just on the other side of that, it's a Saturday, so nothing's happening today, but there's an elementary school, and I see the kids, on their way to school in the morning. Some of them go home for lunch during the day and then come back at the end of the day. Their parents wait and greet them and walk them home. There's pharmacies, there's doctors, there's all of this stuff that, I grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis. It was 55, 60,000 people, and it was very spread out. And so you squish all that in, everything that you needed to support that has to fit now in that box, in that space of a square mile. So City Hall is here, the fire departments, the police stations, the ambulances, the schools, the pharmacies, the doctors, all of that has to exist again for 60,000 people in that square mile. And so it creates different contexts. It also can make things look like they're bigger issues than they are. And other things are bigger issues. But I think we have to kind of step aside and go, okay, yes, urbanism, urban ministry, a lot of these things had supremacist, racist, classist connotations to them that I just don't find helpful, because calling it an urban issue took the place of calling it a Black issue or a migrant issue or an immigrant issue. And like, those are our neighbors. If that's actually going on, like, we owe it to them to see that they get the help and care and support that they need, so that they can experience a good life. And so within urban monasticism, we do, one of our chapters does say, like, live a life with an urban rhythm. And that just means that, like, whatever that looks like in your context, that you live close enough to people that your life is impacted by the fact that, like, you regularly are crossing paths with them. And as opposed to, like, growing up in a rural context, that's a very different way. That's a very different lifestyle. And it creates different rhythms and patterns for life. And so, yeah, it's helpful, I think, for us to understand that there is no one thing that is an urban life. It can look a myriad of ways depending on your culture, your context, your location, just how dense it is, what the government looks like in your context. Like, I'm fortunate that in France, like, they're very forward with things like transit, parks, schooling, things like that make urban living look one way. When I lived in downtown Minneapolis, like, there was very little transit. I lived in a neighborhood in Minneapolis that at the time had, like, about 25,000 people, and we didn't have a pharmacy, which is wild. It was like retired people and like 20, 30 somethings. It's just like, you've got to be able to make money off just medications, prescriptions with this community. Why do we have to
legally, we need to clarify, he's saying legally make money off of the prescriptions.
But it's just like,
yes.
Depression, anxiety, birth control, like, just those three, like, that should have been able to float a pharmacy in that neighborhood. But it's just like, different priorities create different contexts for living. And so that is kind of what we mean by when we talk about urban within urban monasticism, and why when we get together for our gatherings, our conversations are very pragmatic. And so, when we talk about loving neighbors, being kind and gracious, I tell a story about when I'm at my little corner shop, like 2 blocks from here. It's bigger than a corner shop, but it's the small, close grocery store. The cash register just has the 2 trays, one on each side of the register. You set things on one side, scans it, they put it on the other side. It can go pretty quick. For the folks in my neighborhood who are older, you can see the anxiety that process gives them, because they don't move that fast, and they don't want to break the stuff they're buying. They want to pack things well, and, like, things are rarely scanned in the order that you want to put them in your bag. It's like, let me scan this bag of lettuce first, and then the bottle of milk last. It's like, oh, that's not okay, fine. So one very simple way that I love my neighbors is I stand there and just hold my basket without emptying it. When there's an older person looking a little anxious at the other, like right in front of me, and they will eventually, as they're packing, look up to see like how much time they have, how fast they have to go, realize that I'm in no rush, and you can just see their body just relax, and they'll like half the time they'll look back in their bag and like kind of reorganize things and shift things around before they like grab their next thing. The person running the register doesn't care. Like, it's not, they get paid regardless. Like, they get their phone out and text their friends or look at Instagram or whatever. And then when they're basically done, I'll start unloading my stuff on my side of the register. And it's like, that's so simple, but to get to the point of me being present enough with myself and calm enough with myself in that moment to see what's happening around me, to pay attention and have empathy for the person who is right in front of me, and to see their stress and to see the anxiety that they may be carrying, with just like not having the speed and the dexterity that they may have had 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And then to realize like, oh, I can change this person's day by just standing here, holding the basket I've been holding for the last 5 minutes, for another 30 seconds, another minute. And it's the understanding that these mundane things we do, the simple things we do day in and day out, like that, in a nutshell, that's monasticism. Like, there's no secrets in monasticism. Any prayer prayed in a monastery is just as accessible to you. The ways of life, the monastic rules, they're all published. Like, they really want you to read them. Like, I went to a lot of work to put this together so that you will read it. I'm not hiding anything from you. There's no secret knowledge. That's not a thing that exists in Christianity. And so the difference between a monastic life and not is like, are you committed to prayerfully living into the mundane of your life?
Mm-hmm. I think, I'm going to push back a little bit as far as there's no secret knowledge, because I think the reality is that what you just described is in some ways a quote unquote secret knowledge because of what you started with at the beginning. Of this is a perfect example of what a prayer lifestyle looks like, because the way you described that situation there in the grocery store was, it wasn't just I had empathy on this person. No, I saw the stress.
Yeah.
That's different than just recognize, I think this person's stressed out. No, you saw the stress.
Yeah. I chose to be present with them.
That is something that cannot happen outside of being present with the Spirit first, so that you can be present with your neighbors.
Yeah.
There is a secret knowledge type of thing associated with it. It's not one that's not accessible, but it's one that doesn't necessarily make sense when you are not willing to embrace this kind of living, which is the kind of living Jesus asked us to live. I mean, this is, like you said, it is mundane. It is just life, but it's much harder for us, especially in urban societies in general. It is a little bit harder because everything is a little bit more rushed, because we're all crushed in together.
Yep. For sure.
It does take a little bit more effort and willingness to actually embrace it than just saying, oh, well, I can do this for this person. And, and everything, it is mundane. It is just normal life, but there's there is something different about it.
There absolutely is something different.
You know what I mean? And
For
so
sure.
that's a
nobody just stumbles and becomes a monastic. Like
right.
It's a very intentional process. My point in the fact that there aren't secrets here,
right,
is like there's nothing like. I'll often say you can learn kind of everything you need to know about monasticism in a day, and in a lifetime you won't perfect it.
It's deceptively simple.
It is simplicity.
Yeah,
like it live a simple life. Okay, do you know how hard that is?
Right.
It's very difficult, and so I'm not trying to downplay it. I'm just simply want to acknowledge the fact that, like, yes, you may not see that, you may not experience that, you may not feel the things I do or that somebody else does when they're out and about, because for one of a myriad of reasons, right? But that doesn't necessarily make it a secret.
Right.
It's a skill that needs to be cultivated, and that skill comes from doing the simple things again and again and again. And I enjoy when people have these wonderful experiences with God. But I think for me, a marker of Christian maturity is that you kind of start to lose those mountaintop experiences, because your baseline daily experience with God's presence has come up to the point where it's just like, it's nice. Like, I enjoy God today. I enjoyed God yesterday. And I'm still going to retreats. I still like try to carve out and have these unique experiences with God. But they don't become these things that I have to go from one to the other to sustain myself.
Right.
Like, I can actually have a really profound experience with God by just closing my eyes and being silent and experiencing God's pleasure and joy and love. Great. Like that, I want that for everyone. But the thing is that that's not something that I can just, write a little thing and be like, hey, close your eyes, this is how you do it. Because, and I have written a lot about silence and contemplation. I will get more of that on the website. I have more written than's up there. But like silence, the hardest part of silence is that we meet ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That is most of what we meet. And so then how are you kind with yourself and let go of the things that are coming to you in silence? There's a reason why most people can't even be in silence for more than a few minutes, because it's actually really hard. And if we can't be with ourselves well, we shouldn't be surprised that we can't be with others well. And it's okay, hear me say this, it's okay to do kind things that are premeditated and planned out. Great, do them. I don't want to take anything away from your random acts of kindness, from you doing the pay it forward thing at the drive-through or at the coffee shop, or all of those things can be really wonderful and lovely, and God can meet you and bless you in them, of course. Monasticism is inviting us to something else. And it is a very intentional, simple, slow-lived way of cultivating within ourselves just an incredible awareness of who we are, where are our boundaries, where do we find God within ourselves and outside of ourselves, where do I end and others begin, and like all of that is constantly changing. And that's a lot of work. I'm here to say it's worth it. And especially in the times that we're in, like monasticism saved the church after the fall of Rome. Western Christianity is evaporating. I don't know what role urban monasticism will play in the years to come, but I like to hope and believe that it's not a mistake that urban monasticism has started when it did. I mean, we started the first Sunday of Advent, 2019, December 1st, 2 months before the world shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And even that within our community, we had intended of having like a local community here and maybe some remote stuff online. And then we ended up not being able to meet in person. We had like a dozen or so people in our little, not this apartment, but the apartment we were in at the time, along with like a dozen people online. And COVID basically made us pivot to only being online. And now we have this community that's dispersed across Europe, the Americas, Asia, which is beautiful. But it's also creates these challenges. Like, how do we create resources and things to sustain faith, to invite people into the simplicity, to invite them to come back again to the different parts of our way of life so that they can reflect on and pray through, loving your neighbors, building a better future for your city and creation. Like, how do you do that?
That last one there, because we got about 5 minutes left here. I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time there, because, and maybe this is something that ultimately just means you have to come back for a fourth time, but the how to build a better future for the city and for creation.
Yeah.
Is again something where Misfits wise, we've talked about this a lot over the past 4 or 5 years, however long we've been doing this. But there's always very weird pushback from pretty much every possible angle when it comes to this talk of building a future for the city or for the people in the city through the city.
Mm-hmm.
And all these sort of things. So walk us through, and as watered down a version as you can, what are we actually talking about here? Because I think it also, if I read that part of your book correctly, which is a big if.
Oh, I'm sure you read it fine.
I think it should actually kind of wrap up a lot of what we talked about today well. And then should also lead us into the whole rhythms discussion with Nate in the coming weeks.
Yeah, great. Building is hard. I just want to start by saying that. Tearing things down is really easy, and it's very dangerous because we often don't understand the ramifications of what we're pulling apart. And so when we talk about building a better future, specifically for our cities, but also for creation, it requires us, one, to put ourselves in postures and positions where we aren't leading. I know a lot about the church. I know a lot about translating linguistics, liturgy, studied homiletics and preaching. I'm good at those things. I don't know a lot about a lot of things. I don't know enough about a lot of things. And so when we come to want to build things that will lead to a better future, the question for us really should become, who can we support and how can we support them? While understanding that, like, this isn't the church we're building. This isn't Christianity that we're building. There are places to do that. I mean, we're building a ministry of urban monastics globally. But the question then becomes like, wow, there's kids everywhere. It takes a lot of work from a lot of people to raise kids well. Are there ways that we can support the things that exist for that? From career stuff to sports to environmentalism to homelessness and refugees. There are so many things that exist in this world that we can make a difference in by lending our support, by lending our skills to people who are doing the work. One of the challenges right now, specifically looking at the United States, is that a lot is being torn down. And it's frustrating. It's not helpful. It's going to hurt people. And the question I have is like, okay, so who's building what will come? Because these things are going to still need to exist. The problems don't go away just because you maybe stop measuring them, you delete the data that shows it's a problem. Like, the problems continue to exist. And if the approaches to meeting those problems and those needs are going away, even if they're not going away, but they're insufficient, it's way easier for us to support building something that then once it's going and moving, people can look at it and go, oh, that's a better solution for the problem we're having. Let's put our efforts behind that. And oftentimes what happens is we get stuck in this belief that we either can only work within what exists. And so we either have to like tear it down to build something new, or, and then there's kind of this like, well, that's the best we can do. And I just don't think that's true. Like, there's so many needs in our communities that we have to be prayerful about. Hey, God, what are you inviting me to participate with? What are you already doing here? And I can guarantee that most of the stuff God is doing is outside of the church.
Yeah.
Because especially here in Europe, but increasingly in the US, like, most people aren't churched. They are out of the church, and God is with them, just like he was with you. And so how do we extend the love and the grace and the kindness and the fruit of the Spirit and all those wonderful characteristics of love to people in our communities and around the world, by helping to build meaningful organizations, systems, networks of care, so that people have their needs met and that they can get to a place of experiencing calm and experiencing just the security and the safety of life that we all should be able to enjoy as children of God, as children of a God who is loving and kind and gracious. If we believe those things about God and that he wants those for us, then we have the opportunity to participate in that. And there's something really lovely about it. It's not the raison d'être of urban monastics. It's not our reason of being. But it is, I don't know how you can spend time intimately with God and not fall in love with the things God loves. And at the top of that list are your neighbors. It's everybody else who was and is to be. And so if and as we fall into prayer, find God and the Holy Spirit in the deepest, darkest places of ourselves and experience that love that transcends our ability to articulate. If we do that and somehow don't come out the other side with more love for our neighbors, that doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't compute that that's possible. Mm-hmm. And the more that we experience God's love for us, a natural response has to be a love and care for others. And so the question then becomes like, well, how do you do that? You build carefully. You support things that are being built well, that aren't harming people. You try to find the people and voices that are doing good things. And you are very cautious about what gets torn down. Yeah.
Awesome. So again, we will continue that discussion probably a couple more times later on. In the meantime, again, Paul Prins, you can find his website. It's urbanmonastic.org. His book will be linked in the show notes, and it will be linked in his guest portal and on the website and all that good stuff. And he'll be back with Nate here next week, assuming that I scheduled all this right, because now I'm not sure if I did. But regardless, he'll be back here soon to finish that discussion as well. So in the meantime, if you want to catch up with all the Misfit stuff, you know where to go, at Ministry Misfit on pretty much everything, including the new Twitch channel, which, again, if you have not already, we're trying to build it for some stuff we want to do this summer. So if you are on Twitch and can help us build it up, you can go to our channel. It's twitch.tv/Ministry Misfit, or those of you that are watching can scan the QR code and get there as well. And again, you can also get all of that through our website, which, speaking of websites, the KFM Broadcasting Network site is online now as well. So if you want to check out the other stuff going on within the network, you can do that at kfmbroadcasting.com. You'll be able to stream shows. You'll be able to read articles written by some of us. You'll be able to find books written by some of us. You'll be able to find all that good stuff at kfmbroadcasting.com. If you want to support the network, you can go to patreon.com/KFM Broadcasting, and you'll get a bunch of exclusive gear, as well as some of the different exclusive episodes and early release episodes and things like that, from not just Misfits, but also from Buddy Walk and Call of a Mentor and Love Thy Neighbor and all that kind of stuff. Or if you want to support Misfits, you can do that by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits. And again, you'll get talking about over there, but also access to that. Nick and I don't know if we're going to be able to do a Bible study, but we don't know how that's going to look because of how everything has looked the past year. So in the meantime, Paul, thanks for doing this. Thanks for streaming in from Paris. He will, again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. You'll be back because I've
Everybody's
already
welcome to join Urban Monastics too if you want. Just reach out online.
Yes.
So.
And then we will he'll be back a few more times, because every time he talks, he ends up offering me a new option to bring him on for a whole nother episode. And he'll be back here in a week or two with Nate, depending on what my calendar actually says, because I don't remember now. So we will see the rest of you all next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com, or by following @Ministry Misfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.